The dispatch rider had called them a traveling circus. That was the word he used, circus, as if the thing camped along my eastern border were some painted novelty, a string of wagons and a dancing bear and men in red coats selling honey wine to farmhands. I had not ridden 3 hours through cold October rain to look at a dancing bear. I had ridden because 12 wagons of unknown wolves had crossed my border at Varneth's eastern gate without a permit, without a herald, without so much as a flag of courtesy, and because my border captain, a careful man who did not send for me lightly, had written that the wolves in the troop felt old, felt strange, felt like something he did not have the right word for and was not willing to dismiss. I left my escort at the tree line. I left my title at the tree line with them, which I had not done in 11 years. My captain gave me a look I chose not to acknowledge. I pulled a plain wool cloak over my riding gear, unclasped the chain at my throat, handed it to my second without ceremony, and walked toward the light. The encampment was loud from 50 yards out. I could hear fiddle music, a drum with a broken skin, the high laughter of men who had been drinking since before dark. The wagons were drawn in a rough crescent around a central fire, 12 of them, painted once in reds and golds, the paint now faded and cracked from years of road, grime, and weather. Canvas panels hung between the wagons, printed with faded lettering, Travath's wandering company of wolves and wonders. A banner had torn at one corner, and no one had repinned it. It snapped in the wind like a complaint. I walked in through the gap between 2 wagons, and no one looked at me. That was the first thing I noticed, the ease with which a stranger could simply walk into this place. A man sold me a cup of wine I did not drink for 2 copper coins and went back to his conversation. Children ran past my knees. A wolf in half-shifted form lay on its side near the fire, sleeping. I stood at the edge of the firelight and watched. There were perhaps 30 wolves in the company, plus a handful of humans who had the look of people who had traveled so long they had stopped noticing where they were. The performers I could identify easily, a pair of brothers who did tumbling from the build of their arms. A woman who wore blades on her belt with the casual ease of someone who threw them for a living. A heavy-set man with a wolf tattooed on his neck who was almost certainly the troop master, seated in a camp chair near the fire with the posture of someone accustomed to being the largest thing in any room. I catalogued all of this in the first 2 minutes. My captain had been right that there was something old in the wolves here. I could feel it in the air, not threatening, not organized, not political. Just old. These were border wolves, landless wolves, wolves whose bloodlines had never settled to a pack and a territory and a lord. They traveled because they had always traveled. There was a history in that, and I was prepared to let them move on at dawn with a formal warning and no further trouble. Then I saw her. She was working the far end of the encampment, where the firelight barely reached. Not performing, not yet, perhaps not tonight. She was rigging. A rope had come loose from its anchor at the top of the tallest wagon, a rope that another person would have called a problem for the morning, and she was fixing it in the dark and the cold with the unhurried attention of someone for whom the rope's being wrong was simply not acceptable. She climbed without a net. That was the first thing that registered. The wagon was perhaps 20 feet at its highest point, and she went up its side the way a person goes upstairs, steady, choosing her holds, not rushing. She wore no coat. The cold had turned her breath to vapor, and it drifted around her in the torchlight as she worked the anchor at the top, her hands sure on the knot, her body balanced on a plank no wider than my hand that protruded from the wagon's roof like a forgotten afterthought. I watched her work for perhaps 3 minutes before I understood what was happening to me. It was not the watching itself. I had watched skilled people work before, my own pack's fighters and trackers and builders, people whose competence I respected without it meaning anything personal. This was different. This was the difference between observing a fire and standing too close to one. Something in my chest had gone very still, the way the air goes still before a storm breaks, and every part of my attention had narrowed to this one woman on a wagon roof in the cold dark at the edge of my territory, fixing a rope that nobody had asked her to fix. My wolf, who had been quiet for years, genuinely, deeply quiet, the way a wolf goes quiet when it has decided there is nothing worth stirring for, had lifted his head. I found a place to stand near one of the painted wagons, in the shadow of a canvas panel, and I stayed there. She came down eventually. She checked the anchor from below, gave the rope a testing pull that made it ring like a held note, and seemed satisfied. She dusted her palms on her trousers and looked up at her work one more time with an expression I could not fully read from where I stood, something between pride and a private grief. as if the doing of a thing well was a pleasure she did not often get to share with anyone. Then the troop master's voice cut across the encampment. "Senna," he did not look up from his fire when he said it. He had a cup in one hand and was talking to two other men, and he simply said her name into the air between sentences, the way a person snaps fingers at a dog. "The East Side torches, they're guttering." She went. Without hesitation, without acknowledgement, she simply turned from her rope and walked toward the east side of the encampment and began refilling the torch reservoirs from an oil can she retrieved from the supply wagon. I watched her do it. I watched her do it the way I had watched her on the rope, the same steadiness, the same unhurried quality, the same absence of complaint. 3 of the torches she refilled from below. One she had to climb a wagon spoke to reach, and she did that too, the oil can hooked in the crook of her elbow. No one thanked her. She set the can back in the supply wagon and stood for a moment at the edge of the torchlight with her arms loose at her sides, breathing the cold air, and I thought she would go back to whatever else needed doing. But she didn't, not immediately. She tilted her head back and looked up at the sky. The clouds had broken, there were stars. She looked at them for a long time, longer than I would have expected from someone who had just been handed another task the moment she finished the last one, longer than someone with more work ahead of her could afford. She simply looked up, and her face in the cold starlight was, I searched for the word and could not find one that fit. Not beautiful, though she was. Not sad, though there was something in it. It was the face of someone who had learned to take the small things, stars, the ring of a well-tied rope, the heat of the torches she had filled, because the larger things were not on offer. My wolf pressed forward in my chest, like a tide against a wall. I got a second cup of wine I didn't drink and moved closer to the central fire. I found a place at the edge of the firelight, a folding stool someone had abandoned, and I sat down with my hood up and my cup in my hands and looked like a man who was simply tired and warming himself, which was at least partially true. The troop master's name was Travath, his own name on his own company, which told me something about the size of his ego before I had learned anything else about him. He was perhaps 50, broad and gone somewhat to flesh, with the air of a man who had once been formidable and was content to remember it. He wore a wolf's pelt across his shoulders that I suspected was not from a wolf in his pack. He talked a great deal. He drank considerably. His 2 companions nodded at appropriate intervals. He mentioned Senna twice in the next hour, both times to give her work. He did not look at her when he spoke to her. She came when called, completed what was asked, and removed herself from his attention again without lingering. I noticed that she did not sit at the fire. The other performers did, the tumblers, the blade woman, the older wolves who seemed to be some combination of stagehands and guards. They had cups and food, and they laughed at each other's stories. Senna moved at the edges. When she finally paused, she sat on a supply crate behind the wagon row, alone, with a heel of bread and what looked like cold tea, and she ate and drank with a quietness that was not sadness, but was something adjacent to it. A person who had made a separate peace with being on the outside of things. The wolves in the encampment had noticed her, I realized, watching more carefully. Not the human performers, they ignored her as thoroughly as Travath did. But the wolves, the older ones, the border wolves with the old bloodlines I had felt when I walked in, they drifted. Not obviously. Not the way a pack drifts toward its alpha, with intention and display. More the way iron filings drift toward a magnet when you don't quite realize the magnet is there. One of the older she-wolves had settled near Senna's supply crate without appearing to make a decision about it. 2 of the younger wolves who had been chasing each other around the wagon row had gradually, over the course of 20 minutes, ended up sitting at Senna's feet, leaning against her legs as she ate her bread and looked at the stars. She reached down absently and laid her hand on the head of the nearer wolf. The wolf's eyes closed. I set down my wine cup. There is a phenomenon that lichen scholars call the moonpull, an older name for the mate bond's earliest stage, before the mark manifests, before the wolf names it. It is described in the oldest texts as a gravitational thing, a sensation of the world tipping slightly to one side, as if the ground has quietly reorganized itself around a new center. I had read about it. I had governed a kingdom for 11 years and listened to my bonded wolves describe it at the feast table and never understood what they meant, because I had never felt it myself. I felt it now. The world had tipped. The center of everything in this encampment, this muddy torchlit crescent of painted wagons and border wolves and fiddle music. The center of everything was a woman on a supply crate eating cold bread with two wolves asleep on her feet. And some part of me had known at the moment I saw her climbing in the dark to fix a rope no one had told her to fix. I did not move. I was very practiced at not moving when I needed to think, and I needed to think. I needed to understand what I was looking at. She wore a leather cuff on her left wrist. I had noticed it earlier and filed it as decoration. Some performers wore bands and rings and chains as part of their stage presentation, carried into daily life out of habit. But I noticed it again now with the attention I should have given it the first time. It was not decorative. It was wide and worn, and the buckle was old, and she wore it in the manner of something functional, something that covered something. She had worn it so long the leather had shaped itself to her wrist. I knew what a mark cuff looked like. I had seen them once in the library of my grandmother's keep, sketches from an older era, when fated mates were separated by politics, and war and one or both of them had to hide the bond mark to survive. A wide leather cuff, worn always on the left wrist, always buckled tight. Always functional looking so no one would think to ask about it. My chest made a sound I did not make out loud. I sat at that fire for another 2 hours. I watched her refill the torches a second time when they started guttering again. I watched her check the rope she had rigged, from below, just a glance, the way a craftsman checks their work, and nod once and move on. I watched Travath call her name 3 more times, and watched her answer 3 more times without complaint, and without anything in her face that I could read as resentment, which somehow struck me as more significant than resentment would have been. Resentment meant you still believed it could be different. What she had was something quieter and harder. The stillness of someone who had been where she was for so long she had stopped measuring the distance to anywhere else. I did not sleep that night. I borrowed a blanket from the man who had sold me wine, wrapped it around my shoulders, and stayed at the edge of the fire through the small hours while the encampment quieted around me. And I thought about my kingdom and my border and the 12 wagons of landless wolves who had crossed it without permission. And I thought about a woman on a rope in the cold dark. And I let the two thoughts sit beside each other until I understood what I was going to do. Near dawn, when the fire had burned low and the encampment was dark and still, she appeared again. She came from the direction of the supply wagons carrying a bundle of kindling, and she rebuilt the fire without waking anyone, feeding it carefully so it caught without smoke. She sat back on her heels when it was going and held her hands out to it. In the new firelight, I could see her clearly for the first time. She was perhaps 25, slight in the way of people who work hard and eat less than they should, with a calm, even-featured face that was hard to look at quickly and understand, and easy to look at slowly for a long time. Her hair was dark and pulled back in the kind of knot that gets put up at the beginning of a long day and stays there. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow that looked like it had come from a rope. Her hands at the fire were capable hands, scarred at the knuckles, steady. She sensed me watching. Not with alarm, with the easy wariness of someone who is accustomed to noticing things. She turned her head and looked at me across the fire. I did not look away. She held my gaze for a moment, then she looked back at the fire. "You're not from the troop," she said. Not an accusation, an observation. "No," I said. "Looking for work," still watching the fire. Her voice was low and even. "No." A pause, the fire popped, passing through. "Not exactly." She glanced at me again. Whatever she was trying to read in my face, she apparently decided it was not a threat because she didn't move away, but she also did not continue the conversation. She watched the fire. I watched her. The old wolves who had settled near her during the night shifted in their sleep. "The rope at the top of the far wagon," I said finally. "You re-rigged it." She looked at me more fully this time. "I did." "The old anchor point had fatigued. You replaced it." "It was going to fail in the next wind. It would have brought the whole line down." She said it without particular emphasis, just the fact of it. No one else was going to do it. "What do you do?" I asked. "In the performances?" "The rope," a slight pause. "I walk it. Sometimes I run the fire at the beginning, light the torches, manage the fuel line, the high work." "The high work," I repeated. "The things that need doing in the air," she said, with a quietness that told me she had learned not to call it what it was, not to give it the weight of pride or skill, because giving it that weight would require someone else to agree with her assessment, and no one here was going to do that. "And they pay you well for the high work," I said. Her mouth curved slightly. It was not quite a smile, but it was the shadow of one. "They pay me in board and travel." I looked at her wrist, at the cuff. She noticed me looking and very slightly, almost imperceptibly, shifted so that her left hand was closer to her body. "How long have you been with this troupe?" I asked. 7 years. "And before?" "Another troupe, a beat, and before that another." "Traveling since childhood, then." No pack, no territory, no name to place her. That was what the border wolves' children became, sometimes the ones born outside a pack's protection, outside the registers and bloodlines. They traveled. They found work where work was offered. They learned not to ask for more than board and travel. "The cuff," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "It's old," she said finally. "I've worn it since I was small. My mother put it on me." Another pause. "She said it was better hidden." "Did she tell you why?" "She died before she could," said without drama, simply the next fact in the sequence. The fire was warm. The encampment was beginning to lighten at the edges, the very first gray of dawn touching the canvas of the wagon tops. Somewhere a bird started, stopped, started again. "I'm going to need to speak with Travath this morning," I said. "About the troops' permit, about their crossing into this territory." She looked at me steadily. "You're the permit authority." "Yes." "You're not just passing through." "No." She held my gaze for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes, not fear, not calculation. Recognition, maybe, of a kind neither of us had names for yet. "Will he be difficult about it?" she asked. She meant Travath. "Possibly," I said. "Men like that usually are. When something is being required of them they haven't agreed to yet." She nodded once as if she had expected this, and looked back at the fire. I stayed. Travath was difficult about it. He was the kind of man who met authority with bluster first and calculation second. He had been running an autonomous troop on the border roads long enough that he had developed a reflexive resistance to being told what to do, even by someone who had every right to tell him. He received me in the entrance of his personal wagon with the bearing of a man who was choosing to be inconvenienced rather than worried, which was his first strategic error. I had shed the hood by then. I had not announced myself in words. I didn't need to. My captain had arrived with 4 wolves at the edge of the encampment at first light, their livery visible, their bearing that of men who were waiting for something and not impatiently. Travath had looked at them, then at me, and had done the arithmetic in the time it took him to take one breath. To his credit, he recovered quickly. He invited me in. He offered wine I declined. He adjusted his posture from inconvenience to deferential, and he began the conversation with appropriate apology for the border crossing, a clerical oversight. His herald had taken sick, the usual story, plausible enough that I could have accepted it if I had wanted to and moved on. I was not going to move on. "Tell me about your performers," I said. "Your full company." He listed them. The tumblers, 2 brothers from the southern reaches, solid pack ancestry, clean record. The Blade woman, a solitary wolf who had been with him 3 years, no trouble. The stagehands, the animal handlers, the musicians. He was thorough and he was careful, and he listed everyone with the practiced ease of a man who had done this before, presented his company to a border authority, and talked his way through to the other side. He did not mention Senna until I said the name. A very slight pause. "Rope Walker," he said. "Fire management, she handles the rigging, good at the high work." "How long with you?" 7 years. "Pack affiliation?" "None registered. She came up from the southern border troop, unregistered wolf, not unusual for this kind of company. We run a lot of wolves who don't have pack papers." "Her background?" "I don't have documentation on her background," a shade too smoothly. "As I say, unregistered, came to me as a girl. Her mother had been in the circuit before her, died on the road. Senna came with the wagon." "Came with the wagon," I said. "As it were." I looked at him for a moment without speaking. He was a careful man, Travath, not a stupid one. He knew I was looking for something, and he was trying to determine what it was before I named it, so that he could decide what version of the truth to offer me. "Her wrist," I said. His face did something very controlled, a fractional tightening at the eyes. "I wouldn't know anything about that," he said. "I think you would," I said. "I think you've known for 7 years. I think that's why she's still here, instead of having been released to a pack who could register her and give her a name." I think that's what the board and travel is for. Traveth said nothing. You've been keeping her moving, I said. Territory to territory, border to border. Unregistered, undocumented, no permanent address where anyone could find her or identify her. Very convenient for a man who has a wolf in his company whose mark he doesn't want identified. My lord, I'm going to speak with her now, I said, alone. She was at the east edge of the encampment, coiling a length of rope with the same systematic attention she gave everything. She looked up when I approached, and something in her expression told me she had been waiting, not for me specifically, but for whatever the morning was going to bring. She had that quality, Senna, a readiness that was not tension. Like a rope strung to exactly the right tautness, not slack, not likely to snap. I sat down on the supply crate nearby. She stayed standing, the rope half coiled in her hands. He told you something, she said. He told me very little. That's why I wanted to speak with you. She looked at me steadily. In the morning light, she was clearer than she had been at the fire, the scar above her eyebrow, the old watchfulness in her eyes, the particular quality of someone who was accustomed to being useful and nothing more. What do you know about your mother? I asked. A breath, not much. She died when I was 6. She told me her name was Marin. She told me she had come from the north, from a cold country, she said, with a high keep above a river. She told me she had left because she had to. She paused. She put the cuff on my wrist when I was 3. She said the mark under it was mine and no one else's, and I was to let no one take it. Did she tell you what the mark meant? She said it was old. She said it had been waiting. A very slight pause. I didn't know what to do with that when I was 6. And after, when you were older? I tried to find out. I asked in packs when I was with troops that traveled near pack territory. No one knew the mark, or if they knew it, they weren't saying. Her eyes moved to mine, direct, without evasion. Traveth knows. He recognized it the first winter I was with him. I saw it in his face. He never said anything to me, but after that, we never stayed anywhere long enough for me to talk to a pack elder. A beat. I should have left, I know that. Why didn't you? She looked at the rope in her hands. Because leaving would have required knowing where to go, she said. And I didn't know, I still don't. She set the coil down on the crate. I'm very good at the high work, my lord. I'm very good at fixing things that are broken and doing the difficult jobs that need doing in the cold and the dark. I am less good at knowing where to go when there is nowhere to go. I was quiet for a moment. The encampment was stirring around us, the morning sounds of fires being stoked and animals fed and people beginning the work of the day. My wolves at the tree line were still there. My captain was watching. I was aware of all of this in the peripheral way that a king is always aware of his surroundings, and I set all of it aside. I'd like to see the mark, I said, if you're willing. She looked at me for a long moment. I waited. I was prepared to wait as long as she needed, a minute, an hour, the whole morning. You know what it is, she said. It was not a question. I believe I do. And if you're wrong, then I've asked a woman to show me her wrist in the cold, and I owe her an apology, I said. And the troop gets a formal warning and moves on at midday with their papers in order. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite the smile I had seen a shadow of before, closer this time. She unbuckled the cuff. She had to work the buckle with her right hand because it was stiff with years of use, and she did it without looking at it, her eyes still on mine. The leather came free and she folded it back, and I looked at her left wrist. The mark was old. That was the first thing I understood, not old as in faded, but old as in deep, as in written into the skin by something that had existed long before either of us had. It was the shape of a crescent threaded through with a knotwork that I had seen once before in my life, in the stone above the gate of Varneth's oldest tower, where my bloodline's founding marks had been carved before the first stones of the keep were laid. My grandmother had told me once that there were 2 marks. One was the founding mark of the Varneth line, carved in the stone. The other was its answer, carried in the body of the one the line had called its true Luna from the beginning, the mate the bloodline had been seeking since the compact was made. The 2 marks were meant to be brought together. When they were, the compact would be fulfilled. She had worn the answer on her wrist since she was 3 years old. I was aware that I had stopped breathing in any meaningful way. It's the right one, she said quietly. She was watching my face. Yes, I said. What does it mean, truly? I looked up at her. There was something in her eyes that was very carefully not hope. something that had learned not to be hoped too quickly, that had been somewhere hopeful before and found nothing there, and had decided that carefulness was wiser. "It means," I said, "that you are my mate, that you have been my mate since before either of us was born, that the mark on your wrist and the mark above Varnith's gate are two parts of the same thing, and they have been waiting to be in the same place since the founding of my line." She was very still. "And it means," I said, "that Travath has known this for 7 years and has been keeping you away from any pack elder or lichen lord who might recognize it, because a wolf with a mark like that has a great deal of value to the right person, and Travath did not want the right person to find her." She closed her eyes for a moment. I watched her absorb it, all of it at once, the way you absorb something large, something that reorganizes everything you thought you knew about your own life. When she opened them again, her face was very composed, with the composure of someone who has learned that falling apart is a luxury unavailable to people in her position. "You're certain," she said. "Completely," I said. A breath. "And what happens now?" "Now," I said, "I would very much like to take you out of this encampment, if you're willing." I watched her carefully when I said that last part. I meant it, if you're willing, because I had not ridden 3 hours and spent a night at a stranger's fire and waited until dawn to find the woman the mark on my gate had been calling for since before I was born, only to hand her one obligation in exchange for another. Whatever Travath had made of her 7 years did not get to set the terms of what came next. She looked at me for a long time. I let her look. "You're asking," she said. "Yes. Not telling." "No." Something in her face shifted, something very small and very old, like a knot loosening that has been tied for so long it has almost forgotten it was ever a knot. "I'll need my rope," she said, "and the kit in the second supply wagon, the tools. I don't have much else worth taking." "We'll take whatever you want," I said. Travath tried. I will say that for him, he made an attempt. When Senna and I walked back through the encampment toward the central fire where most of the troop had gathered for the morning, he was on his feet before we were 10 paces away, his face arranged into something between protest and appeal. "My lord," his voice carried across the encampment, heads turned. "The girl is under contract with my company, 7 years remaining." "I would ask." "There is no contract," I said, not loudly. I found that I did not need to be loud. "I have the documentation." "Travath?" I stopped walking. I looked at him across the morning light, and I let him see what was in my face, not anger, because anger would have implied he was worth my anger, which he was not. Simply the facts clearly held. "You have spent 7 years transporting my fated mate across my own border territories, keeping her away from any authority who might identify the mark on her wrist, and profiting from her labor in exchange for concealment. Whatever documentation you have is documentation that describes an arrangement made under circumstances that no lichen court in this kingdom will recognize as valid. I suggest you let this go." The encampment was very quiet. Travath's jaw worked. He looked at Senna, not at me, at her, with the calculation of a man weighing whether she might be persuadable, whether she might stay or protest or provide him some advantage. She was looking at me. He looked back at me, and he let it go. We walked out of the encampment in the early morning light, through the gap between the 2 wagons where I had come in the night before, past the faded canvas and the cracked paint and the banner that was still snapping in the wind. My 4 wolves fell in at a respectful distance. My captain brought the horses. At the edge of the tree line, Senna stopped and looked back. I stopped with her. She stood for a moment looking at the wagons and the fire and the wolves who were watching from between the canvas panels, and her face was quiet with the particular quiet of someone who is not sad to leave a place but is still marking it. 7 years of waking in the cold and climbing in the dark and filling the oil cans and answering when her name was called. It deserved a moment. I gave her the moment. Then she turned and looked at the horses and looked at me and said, "I've ridden pillion before. I'm all right with horses." "Good," I said. We rode. Varnith Keep sits above the gorge of the Ardle River, my grandmother's keep, her grandmother's keep. 5 generations of lichen kings, and their lunas living above the sound of moving water and the cold, clean air off the plateau. I had grown up in it, and I had governed from it for 11 years, and I thought I knew every version of what it looked like. I had not known what it looked like through her eyes. She was quiet for most of the ride. Not withdrawn, she answered my questions, asked a few of her own, took in the landscape with the steady attention of someone who is used to reading territory and noting what is there. She asked about the gorge, about the rock formation that marked the border, about the name of the tree line. She did not ask about herself, about what was coming, about what it meant to be a mate to a lichen king in a keep above a river she had never seen before. I thought she was saving those questions, or perhaps that she had not yet located them, that they were still forming themselves in the space behind the years of waking up to cold and rope and someone else's fire. We crossed the bridge over the gorge in the late afternoon, when the light was going gold and low across the water. I felt her shift slightly behind me when the keep came into sight, the stone of it, the height of it, the main tower with the founding mark carved above the gate just visible in the angle of the light. Her breath changed, I heard it. "The mark above the gate," she said. "Yes. It's the same. Yes." Silence, then very quietly, she really did know my mother. "She knew," I said. We crossed into the courtyard. My people were there, my wolves, my staff, my guard, the household that ran the keep and had been running it since before my time. They had seen my captain's horse arrive first, had had the 20 minutes of warning my captain had ridden ahead to give them, and they stood now in the courtyard with the alert stillness of people who understood that something significant was happening without yet knowing its shape. I dismounted. I turned and helped Senna down, her hand in mine, her boots on the courtyard stone, and I turned to face my household. "This is Senna," I said. "She is my fated mate. The Moonbond has called her to Varnith as the founding compact promised, and she has come." And I unbuckled the cuff. I did it myself, gently, carefully, the way you handle something that has been worn for 22 years and has its own kind of memory. I folded the leather back from her wrist, and I held her left hand up so that the mark was visible in the last of the afternoon light. The courtyard went still. One of my oldest wolves, Harwin, who had served 3 generations of my line and knew the old marks the way he knew his own name, made a sound that was barely audible, a low sound from deep in his throat, not distress but recognition, the kind of sound you make when something you were told would happen and half stopped believing in finally does. And then he bowed. And then they all did. Not because I had commanded it, not because ceremony required it. Because the mark on her wrist was the one they had grown up hearing about, the one above the gate, the one their grandparents' had been told to watch for. And it was here, it was real. It was on the wrist of a woman standing in their courtyard who had spent 7 years filling oil cans in the cold for a man who had kept her hidden from exactly this moment. Senna stood very still. I felt her take one slow breath and let it out, and then another. I stood beside her. I kept her hand in mine. "You're all right," I said quietly, not a question. She turned and looked at me, and something in her face that had been very carefully held was coming loose at the edges, not breaking, not collapsing, but loosening, the way a good knot should loosen when the load is taken off it at last. "Yes," she said, "I think I am." We spent the evening in the keep's main hall, a quiet dinner, not a feast, because I judged that a feast was not what she needed on the first night, and I was right. She needed warmth and a table and food that was enough and people who spoke to her like someone worth speaking to. My household was good about it. Harwin told her the history of the founding mark as if she had asked, which she nearly had. She'd been looking at the stone above the main hall's fireplace where a smaller version of it was carved, and he caught her looking and told her everything he knew, which was considerable, and she listened with the complete attention of someone who is finally receiving information they have been owed for a very long time. She asked good questions. That was something I had noted at the fire the night before and noted again here. She did not ask the obvious questions, the ones that were about her own situation, her own future, what would become of her. She asked the structural ones, the historical ones, the questions about how the founding compact worked and what it meant, and why the mark had the shape it did. Later, I thought, she would ask the other ones. She was working up to them in the way she worked up to everything steadily from the outside in. After dinner, she asked to see the gate. I took her myself, with a torch, out through the main hall and the outer corridor and into the cold night air of the courtyard. The gate was lit by 2 iron lanterns on either side, and the founding mark above it was in shadow, but the torch I held threw light up the stone face of the arch and found it. She stood under it and looked up. I stood beside her and held the torch and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the stone wasn't already saying. After a long time, she said, she carried it her whole life. Your mother's? The mark, all those years on the road, on the border circuits, troop after troop. She always knew what it was, and she carried it, and she kept it covered, and she kept moving. A pause. Do you think she was afraid someone would take advantage of it, the way Travath did? I think it's likely, I said. The founding compact is old, but people who know the old marks know they have value. A wolf with the answering mark could be used as leverage against my line, against me, against whoever held her. Keeping her hidden and moving was one way to keep her safe. Alone on the road is a strange kind of safe, she said. Yes, I said, it is. She looked at the mark for another moment. Then she looked at me. The torchlight was warm on her face, and she was very close, close enough that I was aware of the warmth of her in the cold air, and the old familiar pull that had tilted the world when I first saw her was steady in my chest, like a bell that had been struck and was still ringing. She said it was waiting, Senna said, the mark. It was, I said. She looked at her wrist, the bare wrist, the leather cuff in her pocket now, the mark visible in the torchlight. She turned her hand slightly so the mark caught the light. It doesn't hurt, she said, not to me really, observation. It won't, I said, not from here. She let her hand drop. She looked up at the founding mark one more time, at the carving in the stone that matched the skin of her wrist, and something in her face completed itself, settled, the way the anchor of a well-tied rope settles when the weight is properly distributed. Not dramatic, not a wave of emotion, just a thing finding its right place after a long time in the wrong one. All right, she said quietly. We went back inside. The days that followed were quiet ones. I had expected perhaps a more turbulent transition. A woman dropped into a keep and a court and a title after 22 years of sawdust and supply wagons and cold bread on a supply crate. I had prepared for it as best I could. I had given her rooms that were warm and had a good view of the gorge. I had asked Harwin to be available for her questions. I had instructed my household to give her time and space, and not to overwhelm her with ceremony before she was ready for it. What I had not fully prepared for was Senna. She was, at her core, someone who understood work, who found structure in it, meaning in it, the steady satisfaction of something done well in the small, ordinary moments of a day. Within 3 days, she had identified every task in the keep that wasn't being done as efficiently as it could be and had begun, quietly and without announcement, to assist with it. The rigging on the keep's main flagpole, which had been difficult to raise in high wind, she re-rigged in an afternoon, and it flew straight for the first time in what my captain told me was at least 6 years. The oil management for the keep's torch system, which had been consuming more oil than it should, she reorganized into a rotation that my household immediately recognized as better and adopted without being asked. She was not dramatic about any of it. She simply noticed what was wrong and fixed it. My wolves adored her within a week. Not because she made any effort to win them over, she didn't particularly. She was warm but not effusive, direct without being blunt, and she remembered their names after hearing them once, which went further than most people understood. The old she-wolf who had settled near her in the troop encampment turned out to have wandered in from the border and attached herself to Senna's horse on the road. Senna had not mentioned this, and I found the wolf in the keep's stable one morning, installed as if she had always been there, with Senna's gear rack conveniently nearby. I did not mention this either. We talked in the evenings after dinner in the way that two people talk when they are learning the shape of each other, not the history, not the facts, which we exchanged gradually, but the texture. The way she thought about things. The way she held an idea and turned it over before she said anything about it. The questions she asked that surprised me, not the obvious ones about power or governance, but the precise ones. The ones about the compact and the old bloodlines and the border wolves, and what was owed to the landless wolves who had been traveling the circuit roads for generations. She had been one of them. She knew things about the border territories that my maps did not contain. I started bringing her into the morning briefings with my captain. Not formally, I simply stopped leaving the room when she happened to be there, and my captain, who was a perceptive man, stopped acting as if it were unusual. One evening, about 2 weeks in, she was sitting across the table from me with a cup of tea and one of the old border records Harwin had found for her. She had been methodically reading everything she could find about the founding compact and the mark and the old packs, and she looked up without preamble and said, "The circuit wolves, the ones like I was. They don't have pack registration because the registration system doesn't account for wolves born outside a territorial pack." Not because they're dangerous or untrustworthy, because the system wasn't built to include them. That's correct, I said. You could change that. I looked at her over my own cup. A border registry, she said, separate from the pack system for wolves who travel the circuit roads. It would give them documentation, status, accountability on both sides. They'd have to register their route and their company, but in exchange they'd have standing in any territorial court. They couldn't be held in arrangements like Travath was running. Any authority could look them up. I considered this. It would require a rewrite of the border charter. Yes, she said. And cooperation from the border captains. Your border captain seemed reasonable. He is, I said. He's been suggesting something like this for years. I haven't had the right frame for it. She looked at me with the particular attention she gave things when she was deciding whether to say the next thing. Then you have it now. I looked at her across the table, at the old record in her hands, and the mark on her wrist, bare now, the leather cuff long since put away in a box she kept on her dresser with her mother's things. And I thought about a woman on a wagon roof in the cold dark, fixing a rope no one had told her to fix, and about a kingdom that had a great deal of things that needed fixing by someone who understood what was actually wrong. I do, I said. The formal ceremony was held at midwinter. Not because midwinter was required. The bond had been real from the moment she stood in my courtyard, and the mark blazed and my household bowed. But Senna had asked quietly one evening if there was a ceremony, and I had said yes, and she had said she would like that. I thought about what she had said about her mother carrying the mark on the circuit roads and keeping it covered all those years, about the inheritance of a thing that had never been able to be what it was meant to be. A ceremony was the mark becoming what it was meant to be, in front of witnesses, in the light. The great hall was full. My pack, my court, my wolves, and a number of circuit wolves who had come in off the border roads, the word having traveled in the way that significant words travel among people who have no fixed address but very good lines of communication. Some of them were people Senna had known on the circuit, which I had not specifically arranged, and which pleased me when I saw it. Harwin read the founding compact aloud, the full original text, which he had been able to recite from memory since he was a young wolf, and which most of the room had never heard in its entirety. The language was old. It was beautiful in the way old things that have been kept carefully and waited patiently are beautiful, not ornate, not showy, but precise, specific, written by someone who understood exactly what they were describing. I stood across from Senna in the center of the hall. She was wearing a dress she had chosen herself, not a court dress which had been offered and politely declined, but a deep green wool with good construction and practical line, which Harwin's wife had helped her find, and which she wore the way she wore everything, without self-consciousness and without apology. Her hair was down, which I had not seen before. The mark on her wrist was visible. She was very calm. I was less calm than she was, which was not something I would have predicted, but there it was. Harwin finished reading. He looked at me. I took Senna's left hand in both of mine. I held the mark in the light of the hall where everyone could see it. This is the compact's answer, I said. The mark that was promised is here. She is my fated mate, and she is Varnath's Luna, and the founding bond is complete. I held the mark up toward the stone carving above the main hall's fireplace. The two marks, the one in the skin and the one in the stone, were in the same room in the same light, for the first time in Varnath's history. The hall went very still. Then the light changed. It was subtle, not dramatic, not a clap of thunder or a burst of gold. A deepening of the warmth in the room, a shift in the quality of the firelight, as if every candle had been turned half a degree toward something it had been trying to reach. The mark on Senna's wrist, which I was holding, which I could feel under my fingers, gave off a heat that was not painful, not alarming, but unmistakable. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Harwin made the sound he had made in the courtyard. Recognition and relief and the satisfaction of something old finally arriving. The hall followed him. Senna looked up at me. There was something in her face that was not the shadow of a smile anymore. It was the thing itself, clear and direct, and it changed her face in a way I had been watching for since the fire in the encampment and had not yet fully seen. All right, I asked. It had become our word between us. Yes, she said. The same answer she had given in the courtyard. The same answer she gave me in most things, with the same quiet certainty of someone who has found that solid ground holds. The border registry passed the following spring. It was the first piece of new governance Varnath had added to the border charter in 40 years, and it took 6 months of negotiation with the border captains and a significant amount of rewriting of old precedent. And Senna sat in on every meeting and asked the questions no one else thought to ask, because she was the only person in the room who had lived on the circuit roads for 7 years and knew what the documents were actually describing. Travath was brought before the border court that same spring. The case was not difficult. 7 years of holding a wolf with an identifiable founding mark away from any authority who might recognize it, under conditions documented by the border registry's new intake records, and confirmed by 3 circuit wolves who had been in his company and were now registerable and therefore able to testify. He lost the company license. He kept his freedom, which was more than I was inclined to offer, and exactly what Senna said was appropriate. He was doing what people do when they find something valuable and are afraid of losing it, she said when we discussed it. He didn't understand what he had, he just knew it was worth something to someone. A pause. I'd rather he live with knowing he was wrong than make a martyr of him. I looked at her across the evening table and thought about how the troop master had used her and how she had just described it, and about the kind of person you become when you spend 7 years being used and emerge from it without bitterness. Not because you have suppressed the bitterness, but because you have genuinely converted it into something useful, a way of seeing clearly, a way of judging without needing to punish. You'd have made a better border captain than half the ones I have, I said. She considered this seriously. I'd be terrible on a horse for 8 hours a day. You ride better than you admit. I ride adequately, she said. There's a difference, she looked at her tea. I'd rather do what I'm doing. What she was doing by that point was a number of things that did not have official titles and some that were acquiring them. The border registry was hers in everything but name. She was working with Harwin on the founding compact's secondary texts, which had never been fully catalogued. She had re-rigged every problematic line in the keep. She had, somewhat to my captain's bewilderment, diagnosed a recurring problem with the water supply to the upper east wing that had defeated 3 different engineers, and had fixed it with the same unhurried attention she gave the flagpole and the oil cans and the anchor point on the wagon roof. The keep ran better with her in it. That was simply true. Not because she was trying to make it run better, because she noticed what was wrong and fixed it and moved on, and did this so consistently and so quietly that it took people a few months to realize that a great many things they had been working around for years were no longer problems. My wolves had stopped treating her like someone who needed to be handled carefully approximately 2 weeks in. By midwinter, she was simply part of the keep the way the stones were part of the keep, foundational, load-bearing, present. There is one more thing I want to say, because it is the thing I did not know how to say for a long time and have been circling for the length of this account. The founding compact describes the bond in formal language, the mark, the recognition, the completion. It describes what happens when the 2 marks are brought together. It does not describe what it is like to stand at a border fire in the cold dark, watching a woman climb a rope she has been sent up alone, and to understand in the space of one breath that the whole world has reorganized itself. It does not describe what it is like to sit across a table from her every evening and watch the way she holds an idea before she says it, or to hear her ask my captain a question in a morning briefing that cuts through 3 weeks of circular argument in 40 words, or to come into the great hall and find her on a ladder replacing a bracket that has been loose since before I can remember, her tools laid out in the ordered way she lays everything out. Because order is not a preference for her, but a kindness she extends to whatever she is working on. It does not describe the particular quality of what it is to be known by someone who was raised not to ask for more than board and travel, and who has decided, quietly and without drama, that knowing me, the real version, the version behind the cloak and the title and the 11 years of governance, is worth her attention. I had ridden to the border expecting to issue a warning to a traveling circus and return by evening. I had been a king for 11 years, and I had believed I understood the territory I governed, including the borders where the landless wolves lived on the circuit roads, including the space between what the compact promised and what had actually arrived. I had understood nothing, as it turned out. The road from that encampment to this evening has taken the better part of a year, and I have tried to be faithful to what it actually was, not a ceremony, not a rescue, but a recognition. She had been there the whole time. The mark had been on her wrist the whole time. The founding stone had been above my gate the whole time. I simply had to be in the right place, in the cold, in a plain cloak with no title to see it. Outside the keep's windows, the Ardell runs in the gorge below the walls, the way it has run for 5 generations of my line. The founding stone is above the gate. The mark on Senna's wrist matches it, as it always did, as it was always going to. She is upstairs now, reading the secondary text with a cup of tea, making notes in the margin with the same deliberate attention she brings to everything. I will go up shortly, and she will show me what she found, and I will hear her think out loud in the way that I have come to understand is one of the great privileges of my life. This woman who learned to do the high work in the dark and the cold, who is now doing it in the light, with the whole of Varneth behind her. Some bonds are announced with fire and ceremony. This one was written in stone and skin before either of us was born, and spent 22 years waiting for a plain cloak and a cold night, and a rope that needed fixing. It was worth the wait.